How much?
This stone is real.
I know what it is. How much?
Let me hear his voice. One word, prove to me he's... I am not sorry for what I did. I would sell every ring in the world to keep my brother breathing. If loving my family is the crime, then keep me.
Welcome, boss. What collateral?
The wedding ring slid across the glass counter, and Vanessa Carter did not let herself blink. "How much?" she asked. The pawnbroker turned it under his loupe. "This stone is real. I know what it is. How much?" Outside, rain hammered Myeongdong. A black sedan idled at the curb, and inside it, Kang Min-ho watched his wife through the streaming window, watched her sell the ring he had placed on her hand, and felt something old and cold uncoil in his chest. 2,000,000 won, the broker said. "It's worth 6. Today it is worth what I say." Vanessa's jaw tightened. She thought of Ambw. She thought of Chidi. She pushed the ring an inch further. "Fine, take it." In the car, Min-ho's driver said nothing. Min-ho said nothing, but his knuckles had gone white against his knee, and behind his eyes, a single sentence repeated itself like a blade drawn slow across stone, just like the last one. He thought he knew exactly what he was watching. He was wrong about all of it. Welcome to your favorite place for Afro-Korean stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from and what time it is over there. If you're here for romance, powerful mafia bosses, and unforgettable plot twists, I have something just for you. My Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection gives you 15 stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories available only through the collection. Simply click the link in the description. Or if you're watching on a TV, pause the video and open your phone's camera and point it at the QR code on your screen. It takes just seconds. Now, let's begin. The rain had not softened when Vanessa stepped back onto the street, and neither had the thing sitting behind her ribs. The cash was thin in her coat pocket, thinner than her family needed, and she folded her bare hand into a fist so she would not keep reaching for a ring that was no longer there. She did not see the sedan. She saw only the phone in her palm, and the number saved under no name at all, and the 3 words she typed with a thumb that would not stop shaking. "It is done." The reply came before she reached the corner. Not enough. Sunday. She stood in the downpour and read it twice. A woman married into one of the wealthiest families in Seoul. A woman who slept under a roof worth more than her whole village. And here she was, soaked to the bone, counting one like a beggar, and being told it was not enough. What could possibly frighten a woman like that into selling her own wedding ring in secret? What was she so afraid of that she would rather lie to her husband than let him see? And why, 3 streets away, was that same husband sitting in the dark of a stopped car, looking like a man watching his life come apart in slow motion? None of those questions would answer themselves tonight. Vanessa pulled her collar up and walked into the crowd, and the crowd swallowed her the way Seoul had been swallowing her for 6 years, completely, and without ever once asking her name. To understand the woman at that counter, you have to go back to a red dirt street in Ambw, to a girl who once believed that if you were good enough and worked hard enough, the world would leave your family alone. Vanessa was 19 when she watched her father sign his name to a debt. She remembered the lender's shoes more than his face, soft brown leather that had never once touched a farm, and she remembered the way the man smiled while he explained the terms, as if he were doing them a kindness. Her father, a proud man with cracked hands and a good name, signed because his pride would not let him say the words "I cannot pay." And for the next 2 years she watched that signature eat him alive. It took the shop. It took the second plot. It took the small brass clock on the wall that had belonged to his own mother. And when the men came for that clock, her father did not fight them. He simply turned his face to the wall. He died before she finished her nursing certificate. The doctors called it his heart. Vanessa knew better. Shame has a weight, and she had watched it press the breath out of a strong man, one payment at a time. At his funeral, she made herself a promise so fierce it felt like a second spine growing inside her. No one would ever own her the way that smiling man had owned her father. A heart, she decided, keeps no receipt for love. It only keeps them for debt. And she would die before she signed her name to another one. She kept that promise for exactly 4 years. Then her brother broke it for her. Chidi was the baby of the family, all charm and no ballast, the kind of boy who could talk a market woman out of her last mango and have her thanking him for the privilege. Vanessa loved him the way you love a thing you have half raised yourself. So when he called her in Seoul, laughing too fast, saying he had found an opportunity, she should have heard the crack under the laughter. She was on a double shift. She told him to be careful, and she hung up. She has replayed that phone call more times than she can count. The opportunity was a loan from men who did not put their offices on any street. Chidi signed. Chidi could not pay. And then, one Tuesday, Chidi simply stopped answering his phone. His flatmate said he had not come home. His friends said they had not seen him. And 9 days later a stranger called Vanessa's number, a calm, patient, almost gentle voice, and explained that her brother's debt was now a family matter, and that families in her position had a way of finding the money when they understood what happened to those who did not. She had no proof he was alive. That was the cruelty of it. They never showed her proof. They only let the silence do the work. And the silence asked her the same question every single night. Was she paying to save him, or paying for a ghost? That question she carried into a marriage she never planned to have. She met Kang Min-ho the way you meet weather, suddenly, and with no say in the matter. She had been hired through an agency to provide private overnight nursing for his ailing grandmother, the old matriarch of the Kang family. And for 3 months, Vanessa sat in a room that cost more than her entire education, while a dying woman gripped her hand and called her by a daughter's name. Min-ho would come at odd hours, always in a dark suit, always with a face like a locked door. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was in the flat, clipped Korean of a man who had learned early that words were expensive and should be spent like money. What Vanessa did not know, what almost no one in Seoul knew, was that the polite shipping heir with the locked door face was also the head of one of the oldest criminal houses in the country. The Kang name moved cargo through the harbor, yes. It also moved other things, through channels that did not appear in any ledger a taxman would ever see. Min-ho had inherited the empire and the shadow both, and he wore the shadow like a second suit, tailored so well that most people never noticed he had two. When his grandmother died, she died holding Vanessa's hand and not his. That detail did something to him that he would never admit. And so, weeks later, when the family elders began circling, muttering that a bachelor could not lead the house, that his refusal to marry was an insult to the ancestors, that a man with no wife had no future worth respecting, Min-ho made a cold and practical decision. He needed a wife who was respectable, foreign enough to owe nothing to any rival house, dignified enough to silence the elders, and unlikely to fall in love with him and complicate his life. He offered Vanessa a contract. She should have laughed in his face. Instead, she thought about a number saved under no name, and a Sunday deadline that came every week for the rest of her life, and she asked one question: how much? You'll want for nothing, he said. That's not what I asked. She held his eyes, which no one did. How much? And how fast? And can I send it where I need it sent? For the first time since she had met him, something flickered behind the locked door. Not warmth, curiosity. He had expected gratitude, or greed, or fear. He had not expected a woman to negotiate with him like he was the one who needed something. They married in a registry office with 2 witnesses and no flowers. Her wedding dinner was a bowl of soft tofu stew at a place near the courthouse, because Min-ho, it turned out, had been quietly obsessed with that particular restaurant for 11 years and had never once thought to take a date there. Vanessa, exhausted and half-numb, watched Seoul's most feared man argue with a waiter about the correct amount of chili, lose the argument, and eat the dish exactly as it came anyway, with the grim resignation of a soldier. Despite everything, despite the ring on her finger that meant nothing, despite the brother she could not find, she laughed. It surprised them both. He looked at her over the steam as if she had done something faintly illegal. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You just fought a war over pepper and surrendered." He did not smile. But he did not look away either, and for one strange second, the locked door was simply a door, with a person behind it. Then the moment passed, and they went home to a marriage that was a business arrangement, and both of them told themselves that was all it would ever be. They were both lying. Neither of them knew it yet. But if you want to understand why a good man would sit in a dark car and think the worst of a woman before he gave her one chance to explain, you have to understand what a different woman had already done to him. Her name was Seo-yeon, and Min-ho had loved her when he was young enough to still believe love was safe. She had been bright and quick and warm in all the places he was cold, and for 2 years she made him think he might get to be an ordinary man after all. He gave her everything. He gave her access to accounts a wiser man would have guarded. He gave her the one thing he had never given anyone, which was his trust, handed over whole and unarmored. She emptied him and vanished on the same night. No note, no fight, no goodbye. Just a series of transfers executed with the calm precision of someone who had been planning it for months, and an apartment stripped of everything that mattered, and a silence where a life had been. He learned later she had never loved him at all. He had been an account to her, nothing more, and she had simply waited until the balance was worth the trouble of leaving. He did not fall apart. Men like Min-ho do not fall apart. They harden. He took the wound, and he built a wall around it, and he wrote a single law on the inside of that wall, in letters he could read even in the dark. Every woman keeps a receipt. Every kindness is an invoice. Every tender look is a down payment on something she means to take. Love was a transaction, dressed up in soft clothes, and the only fools in the world were the ones who forgot it. For 8 years, that law had kept him safe. For 8 years, it had also kept him alone. And then a Nigerian nurse who argued with him about pepper had moved into his house, and something in him had started, very quietly and against his own strictest orders, to hope. Which is exactly why the pawn shop broke him. He had not been following her. He wanted that understood, later, even to himself. He had not gone there to catch her at anything. He had gone to Myeongdong because his grandmother's favorite tea shop was closing after 40 years, and he had wanted, absurdly, to buy his wife a tin of the old woman's tea. A soft impulse. The first soft impulse he had allowed himself in 8 years. He was rehearsing how to give it to her without it meaning too much, when the sedan slowed at the light, and he saw her through a shop window, and saw the ring leave her hand, and watched 2 million won take its place. He never bought the tea. He rode home with the tin still in the shop and the law burning fresh behind his eyes. When Vanessa came in an hour later, soaked and quiet, he was already seated at the long dining table, a single lamp lit, his hands folded like a judge who had already reached a verdict. "You're late," he said. "I lost track of time." She did not meet his eyes. She was thinking of the number, of Sunday, of the money that was still not enough. "I was walking. In the rain. I like the rain." It was such a small lie. She told it to protect him as much as herself. A wife did not drag her husband into the business of criminals if she could help it. And besides, what did this cold stranger care where she had been? But Min-ho heard the lie land, and to a man reading from the wrong page, a small lie and a large betrayal look exactly the same. He watched her wring rainwater from her sleeve, and he thought, there it is, the receipt. He had let himself hope, and hope had cost him, the way it always did. He said nothing else. He simply watched her go to bed, and then he sat alone in the lamplight, and let the wall rebuild itself, higher this time, with her name in the mortar. He would have said nothing forever. Kang Min-ho was very, very good at saying nothing, but his aunt was not. Kang Mi-suk had never wanted a foreign bride within a mile of the family throne, and she had said so at the wedding, and at every family dinner since, and to anyone who would sit still long enough to receive her opinion. She was a small woman with an expensive haircut and the eyes of an auditor, and she had spent 40 years making sure the Kang money flowed exactly where she wanted it to flow. A wife her nephew might come to love was a variable, and Mi-suk did not tolerate variables, so she had done what she always did. She had paid someone to watch. 3 days after the pawn shop, she arrived at the house unannounced, sat herself at the long table without being asked, and laid a slim folder in front of Min-ho with the satisfaction of a cat setting down a bird. "I told you," she said. "At the wedding, I told you." A woman does not come from nothing into everything and stay honest. It isn't in them. She tapped the folder. Photographs. Your wife. Selling her ring. And not for the first time. Jewelry. Watches. A bracelet your grandmother gave her. All of it. Turned to cash. All of it wired out of the country to God knows who. She is bleeding this family dry and sending it home to her people, and you sit here like a stone. Min-ho opened the folder. He looked at the photographs for a long time. Every one of them confirmed the law behind his eyes, and every one of them hurt more than he would ever let his aunt see. "What do you want?" he said finally. "Annul it." Mi-suk's voice was silk over steel. "Quietly. Before it becomes a scandal. Before the other houses smell blood. Send her back to wherever she came from. I've already spoken to a man in immigration. One word from us and her visa evaporates. She'll be on a plane within the week, and this whole mistake will be as if it never happened." She smiled. "I'm protecting you, Min-ho. Someone in this family has to." He did not answer right away, and into that silence, Mi-suk read agreement, and rose, and gathered her coat, pleased. "Have her things sent to a hotel," she said at the door. "It's cleaner that way. Cleaner for everyone." When she was gone, Min-ho sat alone with the folder and the deportation hanging over the house like a blade on a fraying thread. He believed his aunt. Every instinct he had built over 8 bitter years told him to sign whatever needed signing and be free of the woman before she could do to him what the last one had. He spread the photographs across the table and made himself look. Vanessa at the counter. Vanessa pocketing cash. Vanessa at a second shop. And a third. On days he could now match to the hours she had come home late and told him she liked the rain. Each image was a nail, and his aunt had handed him the hammer, and the law behind his eyes swung it for him. Every woman keeps a receipt. He had seen this exact story before. He knew how it ended. A man who had learned nothing from So Yeon deserved whatever came next. And yet, his eye kept catching on one photograph. The first one, the one from Myeongdong. In it, Vanessa was not smiling the way a woman smiles when she is getting away with something. Her face was the face of someone at a graveside. He had spent his whole life reading faces across negotiating tables. It was how men in his world stayed alive. And every instinct he had spent 8 years silencing whispered that this was not the face of greed. It was the face of a person paying for something that was already lost. He heard her then, moving in the kitchen. He had not known she was still awake. He found her at the counter in the dark, warming something on the stove, her back to him. And for a moment, he simply watched her the way he had watched her over the steam of a tofu stew on the strangest wedding night in Seoul. "You're up," she said, without turning. She had learned the weight of his silences, the way you learn weather. "So are you." "I made too much soup." A small shrug. "There's a bowl if you want it. It's not as good as your pepper place." "Nothing is." Apparently. A tired ghost of the old joke, offered like a hand across a river. Any other night, he might have taken it. Instead, he stood in the doorway with his aunt's folder still warm in his memory and said, in a voice flatter than he intended, "Where do you go?" "In the afternoons." Her shoulders went still, just for a breath, but he saw it. And to a man reading from the wrong page, it looked exactly like a woman deciding which lie to tell. "Walking," she said. "I told you, I like to—" "The rain." "Yes." He turned before she could see his face. "Good night, Vanessa." She stood alone in the kitchen with a pot of soup no one would eat, and the terrible knowledge that her husband had begun to look at her the way the world had looked at her father, as a debt wearing a person's face. She did not know what he had seen. She only knew that something between them had quietly died in a doorway, and she had no idea how to raise it. Neither of them slept. He almost signed the papers. But some stubborn thing in him, the same soft thing that had gone looking for a tin of tea, the same thing that had noticed a graveside face in a photograph meant to condemn her, made him rise instead and cross the dark hall to the closet where Vanessa's coat still hung, damp from the rain, and slide his hand into the pocket where he had seen her tuck something away. He told himself he was looking for proof to make the decision easier. His fingers closed on a folded slip of paper. A wire transfer receipt, creased and soft from being held too many times. He carried it to the lamp and smoothed it flat, and read the name of the account the money had been sent to. And Kang Min-ho went very still, because he knew that name. He knew it better than he knew his own. It was not some faceless lender in a country he had never visited. It was one of his own companies. For a long moment, Kang Min-ho did not move at all. The lamp hummed. Somewhere down the hall his wife lay awake, and somewhere out in the dark of Seoul, a machine he owned was closing its fingers around her. And he had just watched the two facts click together like the halves of a trap. He read the name a second time to be sure his eyes had not lied to him. They had not. It was a subsidiary 3 shells deep, one of the quiet companies the family used to hold the debts that could not sit in daylight. The kind of paper that turned a desperate man's signature into a leash. His grandfather had built it. His father had fed it. He himself had signed off on its accounts every quarter without once reading the names on them, because the names had never mattered to him. They had been numbers, rows in a ledger, money owed to the house. One of those numbers was his wife. He sat with that the way a man sits with a diagnosis. And the first thing he felt, God help him, was not tenderness. It was a cold administrative fury, because his mind was already 3 moves ahead, and every one of them was ugly. If Vanessa owed his own company, then the money she had been wiring out of his house had been flowing, through 3 shells and a stranger's calm voice, straight back into his own accounts. He had accused her in his heart of bleeding the family dry. In truth, she had been feeding it, feeding the very hand that was strangling her. But he did not yet know why, and a man like Min-ho did not act on half a picture. So he did the thing he was best at in all the world. He said nothing, and he began to watch. The days that followed were a quiet war, fought entirely in the spaces between words. He tested her the way you test ice, one careful step at a time. He came home early, unannounced, and found her hanging up the phone too fast. He asked, lightly, whether she needed anything, money, help, anything at all, and watched her flinch at the word money as though he had reached for a knife. He mentioned, once, over breakfast, that he had a cousin in Enugu who ran a clinic, a lie, just to see her face. She went the color of ash and changed the subject to the weather, and he thought, with a grief he could not name, there she goes again, into the rain. There was one evening in that long gray week that nearly cracked it open. The building's heating failed on the coldest night of the month, and the 2 of them ended up marooned together in the one warm room, a blanket each, glaring at a space heater as if it had personally offended them. Vanessa, half frozen and past caring, muttered that in Enugu they would simply have moved closer to the sun. Min-ho, without looking up, said that in Seoul they simply paid a man to fix the sun, and that the man was not answering his phone. She laughed before she could stop herself, and he almost smiled, and for the length of one held breath, they were just 2 cold people under 2 blankets, not a suspect and her judge. Then his eyes fell on her bare ring finger where the wedding band used to be, and the space heater went on humming, and the moment froze harder than the pipes. He got up and went to bed. She sat alone with the little orange glow, and understood that even their warmth had a wall in the middle of it now. Every protective instinct she had read as guilt. That was the terrible mechanism of it. Vanessa, sensing she was being watched, knowing, in the animal part of her, that her husband's silences had changed shape, did the only thing a woman raised on her father's shame knew how to do. She pulled the secret tighter. She stopped leaving receipts in her coat. She took her calls on the stairwell. She smiled at dinner and offered nothing. And every closed door she built to keep him safe from her nightmare looked, from his side of it, exactly like a woman with something to hide. They were 2 people trying to protect each other with the same brick wall, each laying it from the opposite side, neither able to see the other's hands. And then Sunday came, as Sunday always did. The call reached her on the stairwell at dusk. The same calm voice, the same patience, that was worse than any shouting. "You are short," the voice said. "Again. I'll have it. Give me 2 more weeks. I sold everything of value Mrs. Kang." The voice used the name gently, and the gentleness was a blade. "You misunderstand your situation. This is not a negotiation. Your brother's comfort depends entirely on your reliability, and lately you have been unreliable. That is unkind to him. He asks about you, you know. He asks whether his sister has forgotten him." Vanessa pressed her forehead to the cold concrete of the stairwell wall and closed her eyes. "Let me hear his voice. One word. Prove to me he's—" "Sunday," the voice said, and the line went dead. She stood in the stairwell a long time. Somewhere above her was a house full of money she was not allowed to touch, a marriage that was a contract with a stranger, a husband who had begun to look at her like a stain on the family name, and somewhere below, in a country she could not reach, a brother she was no longer sure was breathing. She had one thing left to sell that would cover the gap, and she had been avoiding the thought of it for weeks because it shamed her more than all the rest combined. The next morning, while Min-ho was at the harbor, she took the grandmother's bracelet, the one heirloom the old woman had pressed into her hands in those final nights, the one thing in that house that had been given to her out of love and not obligation, and she held it for a long time in the light of the bedroom window, and she had an argument with herself she had already lost. The bracelet was not hers to sell. She knew that. But nothing about the last 6 years had been hers either. Not her time, not her body, not the sleep she had traded away shift after shift, not the marriage she wore like a borrowed coat. She had given all of it to a debt she never took on, for a brother she was no longer certain of, and now the machine wanted the last thing she owned that had any love in it. She thought of her father turning his face to the wall while men carried off his mother's clock. She had sworn she would never be that person, the one who let the smiling men take everything. And here she was, becoming him one heirloom at a time, and hating that the only way to keep her family alive was to keep losing pieces of herself to do it. She carried the bracelet to Myeongdong, and she sold it too. She wept the whole walk home. Not for herself, for the dying woman who had called her by a daughter's name, whose last gift she had just turned into a ghost's ransom, and for the girl in Enugu who had promised, at a graveside, that this would never be her life. What she did not know was that Min-ho was, at that very hour, pulling a thread that would unravel everything. He had not been able to leave the name alone. He had gone into the harbor office before dawn, dismissed his people, sat down at a terminal, and done a thing he had never once done in his life. He had gone looking, personally, through the rows of numbers his family fed on. 3 shelves deep, he found the ledger. And in the ledger, under a heading that made his stomach turn, he found the account. Carter. He read the file. He read all of it. A young man's signature in Enugu. A loan at terms designed to be impossible. A default. And then, the part that made Min-ho set both hands flat on the desk to steady himself. The transfer of the debt onto the shoulders of a family member. A sister. A nurse. The collateral held in reserve. Location secured. To guarantee the family's compliance. He was reading, in the dry language of his own organization, the machine that had been eating his wife alive since before he had ever laid eyes on her. And he understood then, the thing that shamed him most of all. He had looked at her selling that ring, and he had seen So-yeon. He had taken the deepest wound of his life and pressed it over Vanessa's face like a mask, and he had judged the mask instead of the woman. Every ounce of suspicion he had felt had come not from anything Vanessa had done, but from something another woman had done to him 8 years before. His aunt had handed him a story that fit his wound like a key fits a lock, and he had been so grateful for the fit that he had never once asked whether the story was true. It was not the money that had ruined his marriage. It was his own history, walking in and taking a seat at his table, and him too proud to notice it had come. He put his head down on the desk of the empire he had inherited, and, for the first time since he was a boy, Kang Min-ho was ashamed of what his family was. There was a knock. His oldest lieutenant, a graying man named Jae-won, who had served the house since Min-ho's father, stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees, because he had learned long ago that his boss did not sleep and pretended he did. He took one look at the open ledger, at the name on the screen, at the face of a man he had watched become stone over 20 years, and he set the coffees down very carefully. "You found her account," Jae-won said. It was not a question. "You knew." Min-ho's voice was terribly quiet. "I knew there was a foreign woman on the Enugu paper. I did not know she was your wife until the gossip broke this afternoon." The old man exhaled. "I would have told you. I have been trying to tell you something for a week. Your aunt has been in the harbor office, making calls." Min-ho looked up slowly. "What kind of calls?" Jae-won held his eyes, and in that look was the whole grim history of the house, the loyalty, the blood, the things done in the dark that a son inherits whether he wants them or not. "The kind," he said, "that put officers at your door this afternoon." For a moment, Min-ho could not speak. His aunt had not merely wanted the marriage annulled. She had known about the Carter debt, had perhaps known for months, and she had used the very machine that was strangling Vanessa as the rope to hang her with. The gold digger story was not just cruel, it was a cover, laid over the truth like fresh soil over a grave. "Where is my wife now?" Min-ho said. Then he stood up, because shame is useless without action, and he began to plan how to save her. But Kang Mi-suk did not wait for anyone's plans. She had felt her nephew go quiet in the wrong way. 40 years of reading the family's moods had taught her the difference between a man who agrees with you and a man who has stopped arguing because he intends to do the opposite. She saw the way he watched the foreign woman now. Not with suspicion, but with something worse. Something that looked disturbingly like guilt. And Mi-suk understood that if she was going to be rid of the variable, she would have to do it before her nephew found his spine. So she moved first, and she moved without mercy. The immigration official she had spoken of was not a threat, but a fact. A man who owed the Kang family several favors and disliked being reminded of it. One phone call set the paperwork in motion. A query flagged against Vanessa's visa, an allegation of marriage fraud, a bride who had entered the family under false pretenses for financial gain. And because Mi-suk understood that scandal spreads faster than truth, she made a second call, to a gossip account that traded in the private lives of Seoul's wealthy, and she fed them a story so clean and so cruel it barely needed a lie in it. The African gold digger who married into the Kang house and stripped it of its heirlooms, now caught and being quietly deported. By noon the story was everywhere, and the city turned on Vanessa with the ease of a crowd that had been waiting for permission. The hospital where she had once picked up shifts called to say her services were no longer required. So, sorry, a matter of reputation. A woman she had thought of as a friend. Another expatriate nurse who had cried on Vanessa's shoulder more than once, stopped answering her messages by early afternoon. Strangers who had never spoken to her in their lives wrote things beneath her photograph that she would be glad, later, that she never read. The story required nothing of them but their appetite for it, and they were hungry. A foreign woman who had reached too high and been caught. It was the oldest, most comfortable story in the world, and it asked no one to think. By 2 o'clock, 2 officers were at the door, with a warrant to detain Vanessa pending the fraud inquiry. She had just walked in from Myeongdong, her hands still empty of the bracelet, her eyes still swollen, when they took her by the arm and told her she was being held. She did not scream. She did not fight. She had spent her whole life expecting the world to come for her family, and now that it had come for her, some exhausted part of her almost recognized it, the way you recognize a face you have dreaded meeting. She asked only one thing, quietly, as they led her out past the doorman who would not meet her eyes. Does my husband know? No one answered her. And that silence, she would think later, hurt worse than the handcuffs. They held her in a bare room at an immigration office on the edge of the city. A table, 2 chairs, a window too high to see out of, a clock that ticked like it was counting something down. Hours passed. No one came. She watched the second hand crawl and did the arithmetic she had done every night for a year. How many ones still owed? How many things still left to sell? How many Sundays until the calm voice ran out of patience? And for the first time, the arithmetic came out to nothing. There was nothing left. She had reached the bottom of everything she owned and everything she was, and the debt was still not paid, and her brother was still a silence, and no one in this whole enormous city was coming for her. It was the loneliest arithmetic of her life. And in that room, with no lawyer and no husband and no friend in a country of 50 million strangers, Vanessa Carter finally reached the end of the strength that had carried her since she was 19 years old. A junior officer came in near midnight to take her statement, a tired young woman with kind eyes and a stack of forms. She was expecting a fraud confession. She was expecting a gold digger. What she got, instead, was the truth, all of it, spilling out of a woman who had held it alone for far too long. Vanessa told her about Enugu, and her father, and the shoes of the smiling man. She told her about Chidi, the boy who could charm a mango out of a market woman, who had signed his name to men without offices, and then vanished into a silence that asked her the same question every night. She told her about the calm voice, and the Sunday deadlines, and the ring, and the bracelet from a dying woman who had called her daughter. She told her she did not even know if her brother was alive, that she had been paying and paying to buy back a person she had not heard breathe in over a year, and that the worst part, the part that broke her voice in half, was that she might have sold everything and shamed her husband's whole house and lost her marriage and her freedom, all to ransom a ghost. I married a man I did not love to save my brother, she said, and I think I have failed my brother anyway. And now my husband believes I robbed him. Everyone in this city believes I robbed him. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. I only ever wanted to keep my family alive. When did that become a crime? The young officer had stopped writing. Her pen sat useless on the form, because there was no box on that page for what she was hearing. If you have ever given up everything you had for someone you love, and been called selfish for it by people who never saw the cost, take a breath with me here, and if this story is reaching something in you, tap that like button and subscribe, because what Vanessa does next is the part I need you to see. Because Vanessa wiped her face and sat up straight, the way her father had never gotten to, and she said something the young officer would remember for the rest of her career. I am not sorry for what I did. I would sell every ring in the world to keep my brother breathing. If loving my family is the crime, then keep me. But I did not steal from that house. Everything I sold with my own hands, and every one of it went to save a life. She looked the officer dead in the eye. Write that down. Write down that I said it. Enjoying the story so far? Then you'll love my ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection, featuring 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you can't get on YouTube, which you can enjoy anytime. Just click the link below, or scan the QR code by pausing the video, opening your phone's camera, and pointing it at your TV or screen. Your next favorite romance could be waiting for you before this story even ends. The officer wrote it down. And in that moment, across the city, Kang Min-ho learned where his wife was. He had come home to an empty house and a doorman who could not look at him, and a gossip story lighting up every phone in Seoul, with his family's name and his wife's face, and the word fraud. It had taken him 90 seconds to understand what his aunt had done, and another 90 to stop himself from driving to Mi-suk's house and ending 40 years of the Kang family's quiet cruelty with his own hands. Instead, he took the one thing that could undo her. He printed the ledger. The whole file. The Carter account, the impossible loan, the transferred debt, the collateral held in reserve, the entire machine, in his own company's ink, proof that his wife had never stolen a thing, but had been robbed by the very house that now called her a thief. He drove to the immigration office at a speed that would have gotten anyone else arrested, the file on the passenger seat like a living thing, rehearsing for the first time in 8 years an apology he did not know how to give. He came through the doors of the detention office at midnight with the ledger in his hand and his wife's name in his mouth, and he stopped cold. Because there, at the front desk, calm and patient and entirely at ease, stood a man in a gray coat, sliding a folder of his own across the counter to the night clerk. A man Min-ho had never met, but somehow already knew, because he had spent a week imagining the owner of a voice, the calm, gentle, patient voice that had called his wife on the stairwell and named her brother's price. The man in the gray coat turned at the sound of the doors. He took in Min-ho's face and the file in his hand, and something in him relaxed into a small, respectful bow, the bow of an employee greeting the man at the very top of the house he served. "I came to close the Carter account personally," the man said pleasantly. "It seemed the proper thing to do." He straightened and smiled, and spoke the 2 words that turned the floor to water under Min-ho's feet. "Welcome, boss." The words landed in the quiet detention lobby like coins dropped on stone, and Kang Min-ho understood, all at once and all the way down, the true shape of what he was standing inside. The calm voice on the stairwell, the Sunday deadlines, the gentle, patient cruelty that had been squeezing his wife dry for a year. It had never been a stranger. It had never been some rival house or foreign syndicate. It was his. The man in the gray coat drew his paycheck from the house of Kang, worked the Ambw paper on the family's behalf, and answered, like every knife and every whisper in that whole rotten organization, to the man now staring at him with a folder trembling in his hand. Vanessa had been running herself to ruin, to pay a debt owed to her own husband. Every one she had wired into the dark had traveled 3 shells and 1 gray coat and come home to Min-ho's own vaults. He had married the woman his empire was killing, and his empire had gone right on killing her under his roof, and he had been too blind and too proud and too haunted by an old ghost to see it. The collector mistook his silence for command. "The account has been difficult lately," he went on, pleasant as a bank teller. "The woman is unreliable, but I understand she's being deported now, so I've come to write off the collateral and close the—" "What collateral?" Min-ho said. The collector blinked. "The brother, boss. In Ambw, held in reserve since the default, per protocol." And there it was. The word Vanessa had been chasing through a year of silence, spoken so lightly by a man in a gray coat that it barely disturbed the air. Held. Not vanished, not dead. Held. Somewhere in Ambw, Chidi Carter was a line item marked collateral in a ledger Min-ho had signed without reading, a living boy reduced to a guarantee, kept breathing precisely because a corpse cannot be leveraged. Min-ho thought of a girl at a graveside in a country he had never seen, swearing that no one would ever own her family the way a smiling man in soft brown shoes once had. He thought of how completely he had failed her, how the very thing she had fled across an ocean to escape had been waiting for her inside her own marriage, wearing his name. There is a particular horror in learning that you are the monster in someone else's story, and Kang Min-ho stood in that fluorescent lobby and drank the whole cup of it in a single swallow. Something happened in Min-ho's face that made the night clerk quietly decide to be somewhere else. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone very soft, which anyone who knew him would have told you was the most dangerous thing it could do. "You will call Ambw," Min-ho said. "Now, on speaker, and I am going to hear that boy's voice, or I am going to learn exactly how loyal you are when the man whose name you just bowed to asks you a question you don't want to answer." The collector's easy smile finally faltered. He had spent his career certain of one thing, that he served the top of the house, and the top of the house did not care about the numbers, only the sums. He was watching that certainty come apart, and he did not understand why, and men in his line of work do not enjoy not understanding. He looked, for one flickering instant, like every collector who has ever stood in a poor man's doorway and been surprised to discover the debt had a face. He made the call. It rang a long time. Somewhere 6,000 miles away, a phone was lifted, and a voice answered in a language the collector barely spoke, guarded and rough. The collector gave a code. There was a pause, and then a second voice came onto the line. Thinner, younger, exhausted, and unmistakably alive. "Hello? Who is this? Is it about my sister? Please, is Ada okay?" Kang Min-ho closed his eyes, not out of relief, though the relief nearly took his knees. He closed them because he could hear, in the fear cracking that young man's voice, an entire year of Vanessa's nightmares given sound at last, and because every note of that fear had been manufactured by the machine he owned. The boy on the phone was not asking to be freed. He was asking after his sister. Even in a room where he was a hostage, Chidi Carter's first thought was Vanessa, and Min-ho realized the whole family loved exactly the same way. Recklessly, expensively, with no receipt kept, and no thought for the cost. "Your sister is alive," Min-ho said into the phone, in careful English. "She is safe. She has never stopped fighting for you. And you are going home." There was a silence on the line, and then a sound that Min-ho would hear in his sleep for a long time. A young man who had been a hostage for over a year, breaking down not in fear, but in relief, sobbing his sister's name over and over into a phone in a room he had thought he would die in. "Ada, Ada," he kept saying it, as if the name itself were the thing that had kept him breathing. And perhaps it had. Perhaps in some dark room in Ambw, the memory of a fierce older sister who would sell the world to save you was the only ledger that had ever mattered. Then he ended the call, and turned to the collector, and began, very quietly, to take his own house apart. He phoned Jaewon first. Within the hour, the men who had kept Chidi in Ambw received an instruction from the top of the house that they did not dare question. Release the collateral, put the boy on a plane, and consider the Carter file permanently closed. It was the single fastest freeing of a hostage in the family's long and ugly history, and it happened because for once the man at the top had looked at a number and seen a person's brother. The collector in the gray coat stood in the lobby watching his boss dismantle the very machine that paid him, and had the sense, at last, to say nothing at all. But freeing Chidi and freeing Vanessa were not the same thing, and Min-ho knew it, because standing between his wife and her freedom was not a stranger in a gray coat. It was blood. He drove to his aunt's house before dawn. Kang Mi-suk received him in her sitting room in a silk robe, unhurried, pouring tea for two as though she had been expecting him, which of course she had. She was a woman who had survived 40 years at the heart of a criminal house by never once being surprised. "You've been busy," she said, sliding a cup toward him. "The whole family is talking. Some of them think you've lost your mind over a foreign girl." She sipped. "I told them you were simply cleaning up a mess. I do so hate to be made a liar, Min-ho. You knew." He did not sit. He did not touch the tea. "You knew she owed the Enugu account. You knew before you ever put those photographs in front of me. That's why you chose her. A woman our own house already had a leash on, so that whatever she did, we'd own it. And when I married her anyway, you used her own debt to frame her, because a bride we were secretly robbing makes a very convenient thief." Mi-suk set down her cup. She did not deny it. That was the thing about his aunt that had always frightened him more than any rival. She never bothered to lie once lying stopped being useful. "I did what this family has always done," she said. "I protected the money. Your grandfather understood that. Your father understood it. The account was worth a fortune, the leverage was worth more, and the girl was disposable. I gave you a clean way to be rid of her and keep the asset." Her eyes hardened. "You are the one who complicated it by developing feelings for the collateral. She is my wife. She is a line in a ledger, who happens to be wearing your ring." Mi-suk rose, and for a moment the sweet aunt was entirely gone, and what stood in her place was the true keeper of the house of Kang. "Sign the annulment. Let her go home to her freed brother. Bury the story. And in a year no one will remember her name. Do that, and the family survives. Fight me on this, and you will not only lose, you will drag the whole house into the daylight, and every debt, every account, every quiet arrangement your grandfather built will burn with it, including you." She smiled, gently, the way the collector had smiled. "I am still protecting you, Min-ho. I always have been." And there it was, the choice, laid bare on a silk-covered table at 4 in the morning. Protect the empire, and lose Vanessa forever, with a clean conscience the family would happily provide. Or save her, and set fire to the one thing 3 generations of Kang men had killed to protect. Min-ho thought about a graveside face in a photograph. He thought about a young voice 6,000 miles away asking after his sister before asking after himself. He thought about a woman who had sold everything she owned, down to the last gift a dying stranger had pressed into her hands, and had never once come to him for help, because she had learned as a girl that the smiling men always want something, and she had assumed, correctly, to his shame, that he was one of them. And he thought about a story Vanessa had never told him, but that he now understood in his bones anyway. A brass clock, carried out of a poor man's house by men who called it business, and a father who turned his face to the wall rather than beg. His grandfather had built his fortune carrying out 10,000 clocks. His aunt was asking him to carry out one more. "You told me once," Min-ho said slowly, "that a woman from nothing could never come into everything and stay honest. You had it backwards. I came from everything, and I have not been honest in years. She came from nothing, and she is the most honest person I have ever met. She kept no receipt, not for her father, not for her brother, not for me. Everything she gave for free, and every single thing this family ever gave came with an invoice." He shook his head slowly. "You want to know who couldn't stay honest inside all this money? Look in a mirror, Aunt. It was never her." He picked up the tea his aunt had poured. He looked at it, and then he set it back down, untouched, and gave her his answer. "Burn it then," he said. Mi-suk's face did not move, but something behind it did. "You built this house on people like her," Min-ho said. "On fathers who signed away everything to men in nice shoes. On brothers turned into collateral. On women who lose pieces of themselves every Sunday to keep the family they love alive. I signed those ledgers for years, and I called it business because I never once read the names." He was very calm now, calmer than he had been in 8 years. "I read one, and I am not signing anything ever again except my wife's freedom. If the house burns to give it to her, then it was already made of the wrong thing." He walked out while she was still searching for the answer she had never in 40 years needed to find. What Min-ho did over the next 2 days, he did in daylight, which was the most violent thing he could possibly have done. He did not fight his aunt in the shadows where the family was strong. He walked into the light where it was weak. He took the ledger, the real one, the Carter file and 100 like it, and he handed it, personally, to the one prosecutor in Seoul the Kang family had never managed to buy, along with a signed statement in his own name. He gave the gossip account a new story, this one true, and watched the city that had turned on Vanessa in an afternoon begin, slowly, to turn again. He froze the shells, dissolved the debts, and made himself, in the space of 48 hours, both the destroyer of his own inheritance and its last honest witness. It cost him more than money, and he had known it would. By the second morning, the older men of the house had stopped taking his calls. A cousin he had trusted since boyhood sent a single message: "You have killed us all," and then nothing. Rival houses that had feared the Kang name for 3 generations smelled smoke and began circling, because a man who exposes his own empire has shown the world exactly where the soft places are. Min-ho understood that he was trading the safety 3 generations had killed to build for a freedom he was not even sure his wife would want to share with him. He did it anyway. That was the part that would have astonished his grandfather most. Not that he burned it, but that he burned it without any guarantee of reward. Jae-won found him at the harbor at the end of it, gray-faced and hollow, and set down 2 coffees, and said the only thing he could think to say, which was, "Your grandfather is going to claw his way out of the ground for this." "Let him," Min-ho said. "I've been meaning to have a word." And the old lieutenant, God help him, laughed. The first laugh in that office in longer than either of them could remember. Because sometimes when a man has burned down everything he was born to be, the only thing left standing is the joke, and you hold on to it because it is proof you are still human. For what it's worth, Jae-won added, quieter, your grandmother would have liked her. The nurse. She held the old woman's hand at the end, when none of the blood relatives could be bothered to show up sober. He shrugged. Maybe you married the only honest thing this family ever brought through the door. Try not to lose her twice. The charges against Vanessa collapsed like a tent with the poles pulled out. The fraud allegation had rested entirely on the claim that she had stolen from the family. The family's own head had just testified, on paper, that everything she sold was hers, and that the true theft had run the other way for years. By the time they opened the door of that bare little room and told her she was free to go, Vanessa had been awake for 2 days and had stopped expecting anything good to ever come through a door again. She walked out into the gray morning, and Kang Min-ho was standing there. He did not look like the head of a criminal empire. He did not look like the cold husband who had asked her where she went in the afternoons. He looked like a man who had not slept, who had set something enormous on fire and stood in it on purpose, and who had absolutely no idea whether he had the right to be standing where he was standing. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he held out his hand. In it, on his open palm, was her wedding ring. Not a new one, the one. The same ring she had pushed across a pawn shop counter in the rain. The one she had watched become 2,000,001, and a step closer to saving her brother. He had gone to Myeongdong himself and bought it back. And the bracelet too, and everything else. But it was the ring he held out first. I know why you sold it, he said. His voice was not steady. I know all of it. Ambw, your father, Chidi. I know it was my house strangling your family. I know you were paying my company with your own wedding ring. And I stood in a car and watched you do it, and I told myself you were a thief. He drew a breath that seemed to cost him. I had a wife once. Before you. Not a wife. A woman I trusted. She took everything I had and disappeared. And I decided that day that every woman keeps a receipt. That love is just theft that hasn't happened yet. And then you sold that ring. And I didn't see you at all. I saw her. I put a dead woman's face over yours, and I judged you for a crime you never committed. He swallowed. Chidi is on a plane. He's free. You saved him, Vanessa. You did that. I only got out of the way. I don't deserve to put this back on your hand, he said. But it was always yours. It was never a receipt. I'm sorry it took me this long to know the difference. He reached into his coat then and set one more thing on the low wall beside them. A small tin, worn at the corners. The label faded. My grandmother's tea shop closed the day I first saw you sell that ring, he said. I'd gone to buy you this. I never gave it to you, because I saw you at that counter, and I let an old ghost tell me a lie about who you were. I've carried it in my coat for a week like a coward. He almost smiled, and it was the saddest thing she had ever seen him do. It's just tea, but I bought it before I knew about your brother, before I knew about the debt, before any of it. I bought it because you argued with me about Pepper on the worst wedding night in Seoul and made me laugh, and I wanted, for once in my life, to give something to someone and want nothing back. And here is where a lesser story would have her fall into his arms in the gray morning light, and the music would swell, and all would be forgiven. Vanessa did not fall into his arms. She looked at the ring on his open palm, and she looked at the man holding it, the man who had burned down an empire for her, and who was also the reason the empire had needed burning, the husband who had saved her brother, and whose family had taken her brother in the first place. The one person in Seoul who had finally seen her, standing on the smoking ruin of the machine that had never once let her be seen at all. She felt the whole tangled weight of it, love and debt and grief and rage, all knotted together where she could not tell one thread from another. She did not take the ring. You want me to forgive you, she said quietly. And maybe I can. You were lied to, and you were hurt long before me, and you said it right at a cost I don't think you even understand yet. Her eyes filled, but her voice did not break. But it wasn't only you, Min-ho. It was your name, your house. Your grandfather's shoes were the same shoes as the man who buried my father. You are asking me to forgive the man. What do I do about the empire? Can a marriage survive when the thing that nearly killed my family and the thing that just saved it are the same set of hands? The ring sat between them on his open palm, catching the gray light, and neither of them knew whether she would ever wear it again. Behind them, the city was waking, indifferent, the same city that had swallowed her whole for 6 years and never once asked her name. And Vanessa Carter stood on the far side of a question she had never imagined she would have to answer. Not whether she could love him, but whether love was even the right word for what happens when the hand that reaches out to save you is the same hand that once, without ever knowing your name, held the knife. He did not answer her right away, And that, more than anything he could have said, was the first thing that made her believe him. The old Min-ho would have had a reply ready, smooth, certain, a closing argument. This man simply lowered his hand and closed his fingers gently over the ring and said, "I don't know." That's the honest answer. I don't know if it can survive it. He looked at her the way you look at something you are afraid to want. But I'm not going to buy the answer, or bully it, or wait for you in a car and decide it for myself. I did enough of that. Chidi lands at Incheon on Thursday. Go and get your brother. Whatever you decide about me, decide it after you've held him, not before. And then Seoul's most feared man did something no one in the history of the House of Kang had ever seen him do. He put her ring, and her bracelet, and a worn tin of tea into her hands, and he stepped back, and he let her walk away without following. It nearly undid her more than anything else had. Thursday came gray and enormous. Vanessa stood in the arrivals hall at Incheon with her heart in her throat, and a year of unanswered questions crowded behind her ribs, watching a set of automatic doors, as though her whole life would come through them, because it would. She had not slept. She had spent the days since the detention office in a small rented room she had insisted on paying for herself. Not the Kang house, not a hotel Min-ho offered, a plain room with a plain bed, because the first thing a woman does when she has spent 6 years being owned is find one square of the earth that belongs to no one but her. Min-ho had not argued. He had sent nothing, pushed nothing, appeared nowhere. He had simply, quietly, made sure the flight happened, and then stayed out of the frame, and the restraint of it spoke louder to her than any grand gesture could have. In that small room, she had turned the ring over in her fingers 100 times without putting it on. She had set the tea tin on the windowsill and not opened it. She had lain awake and let herself feel, for the first time in 6 years, the full unbearable size of everything she had been carrying. And, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the slow-cooling rage, something she had not felt since she was a girl in Enugu who still believed the world might be kind. It took her 2 nights to name it. It was hope, and it terrified her more than any of the rest, because hope is the one thing a careful woman can never quite protect herself against. The doors opened. People streamed through. Tourists, businessmen, a tour group in matching hats. And then, in a jacket 2 sizes too big and shoes that did not fit, thinner than she remembered, older around the eyes than a young man should ever be, came Chidi Carter, scanning the crowd with the desperate hope of a person who has been promised a miracle and does not quite dare believe it. He saw her, and the whole enormous airport disappeared. She reached him before she knew she had moved, and then her little brother was in her arms, both of them on their knees on the polished floor of the arrivals hall, while strangers stepped around them, and Vanessa Carter, who had not cried in front of another living soul in 6 years, wept as though something long frozen inside her had finally, all at once, broken open into spring. "You came," Chidi kept saying into her shoulder. "They said you would come. I didn't believe them. I didn't believe anyone anymore. But you came. I never stopped," she said. "Not for one single day. You hear me? Not one day. They stayed on that floor a long time." And when they finally rose, Chidi wiped his face, looked her up and down, and said, in the exact tone of the boy who could talk a market woman out of her last mango, "You look terrible, by the way. Being rich clearly does not agree with you." And Vanessa laughed. A real laugh, cracked and wet and enormous. Because of course, a year as a hostage, and the first thing out of him was a joke. And it was the most beautiful proof she could have asked for, that they had not managed to kill the thing in him that made him her Chidi. I sold your favorite watch, she told him as they walked out. The blue one, Ada. He pressed a hand to his chest, mortally wounded. That watch was an heirloom. You bought it at a market stall for 800 naira. It was an heirloom by intention, Chidi said with enormous dignity, and she laughed again, and the sound of it followed them out into the gray Korean afternoon like something being born. That night, in the small rented room, she made him soup and watched him eat 3 bowls of it, and neither of them talked about the year he had spent as a number in a ledger, because some things you circle for a long time before you can land on them. But once, near midnight, Chidi set down his spoon and said quietly, not looking at her, "They told me you'd stopped paying. Near the end, they told me my own sister had given up on me." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. "I never believed it, not for 1 second. I knew if you'd stopped, it was because you had nothing left to sell, not because you'd stopped loving me. That's how I knew the difference between you and them, Ada. They think love runs out when the money does. You taught me it's the last thing to go." Vanessa had to leave the room for a moment after that. She stood in the little corridor with her hand pressed to her mouth, and she thought about a husband who had once believed exactly what those men believed, that love was a balance that emptied, and about how far he had come to unlearn it. And she understood that her brother had just, without knowing it, made her decision a great deal harder and a great deal clearer at the same time. In the days that followed, Vanessa learned the full shape of what her husband had done, and it was larger and more ruinous than she had understood. Kang Min-ho had not simply freed her brother and cleared her name. He had taken the whole architecture of the family's hidden business and handed it to the daylight, and the daylight was not gentle with it. The prosecutor, who had never been bought, moved quickly. Accounts froze. Old men who had spent their lives certain they were untouchable discovered they were not. And at the center of it, refusing every offer to run, refusing to let a single underling take the fall in his place, stood Min-ho, cooperating fully, naming the machine, dismantling in the open the very thing his grandfather had built in the dark. Kang Mi-suk did not go quietly. She fought and threatened and called in 40 years of favors, and found, one by one, that the favors had evaporated the moment the head of the house stopped protecting the shadows. In the end, she was simply another name in a file she had spent her life keeping other people's names inside of. The keeper of the House of Kang was undone by the one thing she had never accounted for, a man at the top who finally read the names. The empire did not merely shrink, it ended. And Min-ho led it, and what rose in its place, slowly, was something Vanessa had not expected, the legitimate half of the business, the shipping, the harbor, the honest cargo, run for the first time in 3 generations without a shadow stitched to its back. It was smaller. It was poorer. It employed men like Jae-won, who had never known any life but the family's and now had to learn one. And it was clean. In a way, nothing bearing the Kang name had been clean in living memory. Vanessa watched him do it from the small square of the earth that belonged to her, and she watched him not once ask her to admire it. He rebuilt in silence, the way he did everything, and he never sent word that he had rebuilt it for her, though they both knew he had. She heard the rest of it in pieces, the way you learn the true weight of a thing, a little at a time, so it doesn't crush you all at once. She heard that he had sold his own family's estate to pay the men who lost their livelihoods when the shadow business closed, so that no honest worker went hungry for a war he had started. She heard that he had testified for 3 days straight and never once shifted the blame onto a dead grandfather who could not defend himself, though it would have been easy and everyone expected it. She heard from J1, who had appointed himself her unofficial and entirely unwanted bodyguard, the thing that stayed with her longest. "You want to know what your husband did?" the old lieutenant told her one afternoon, over tea she had not asked for, the night before he handed the ledgers to the prosecutor. "He came to me," he said, "J1, once I do this, I can never protect you the way the family always has. You should leave. Tonight, I'll give you enough to disappear somewhere warm." J1 shook his gray head slowly. 40 years I served that family. Not one of them ever once told me to save myself. He was the first, and he did it while he was setting fire to his own life. He looked at her with something close to wonder. "Whatever you decide about him, ma'am, that man is not the man his family made. He unmade himself on purpose. I have never seen anything like it." Vanessa said nothing, but she carried those words back to her small room, and she set them beside the ring and the unopened tin, and she found that the pile of things she could not stop thinking about was getting harder and harder to sleep next to. One evening, weeks in, she went to find him. She found him at the harbor, in the office, arguing with a delivery man about the correct amount of chili in a takeout order, losing the argument, and eating the food exactly as it came anyway, with the grim resignation of a soldier. He did not know she was watching. And something in the sight of it, this man who had burned an empire and could still not win a fight about pepper, undid the last knot in her. She stepped into the doorway. He looked up and went very still, the way he had gone still in a lamplit room a lifetime ago over a slip of paper. "I've decided," she said. He set down the food. He did not reach for her. He did not reach for the ring, which she knew he still carried, because a man like Min-ho would carry it until she told him to stop. He simply waited and let her have the whole of the moment, because he had finally learned that the most loving thing he could ever do was to want something and not take it. "My whole life," Vanessa said, "I made myself one promise, that no one would ever own me the way that smiling man owned my father. I built everything on it. I married you on it. I told myself it was a contract, that a contract couldn't own me because I could read the terms." Her voice was steady now, steadier than it had ever been. "But I was still living inside that promise like a cage. Never be owned. It sounds like freedom. It isn't. It's just fear wearing freedom's clothes. Because if you spend your whole life making sure no one can ever hold you, you also make sure no one ever gets to." She crossed the office slowly. "You didn't buy me. You couldn't have. There's not enough money in that whole burned empire to buy 1 hour of me. And the terrible truth is, you knew that, and you burned it anyway. You gave away the one thing your family ever taught you to protect, and you asked for nothing back, and you stepped back and let me walk away." She stopped in front of him. "A man who buys you, owns you. A man who sets you free, and then stands there with his hands open. Him, you can choose. And I have never in my life gotten to choose anything. Not the debt, not the marriage, not the country, not one single thing." Her eyes were bright and fierce. "So, this is the first thing that is only mine. I'm not staying because I owe you. I don't owe you anything. If anything, the ledger runs the other way, and we both know it. I'm staying because I want to. Because a cold man argued with a waiter about pepper on the worst night of my life, and made me laugh, and I have wanted, ever since, to find out who he is behind the locked door." She held out her hand, not for him to give her the ring, but palm up, open, the way he had held his to her outside the detention office. "Put it back," she said. "Not because it seals a contract, because I'm choosing to wear it. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that has ever mattered to me. Kang Min-ho's hands were not steady as he took the ring from his coat. They were not steady as he slid it back onto her finger, over the place that had been bare since a rainy afternoon in Myeongdong. And when it was done, he did not pull her into some grand embrace. He simply lifted her hand and pressed his forehead to it, the way a man kneels to something he had almost lost through his own blindness and has been given back by grace he does not deserve. "I want nothing back," he said, muffled, fierce. "Do you understand? For the rest of my life, nothing back." "I know," she said softly, and put her free hand in his hair. "That's why I came." Chidi, who was staying in the small rented room and had strong opinions about the wedding they were clearly now going to have to do properly, put it best a few days later, watching his sister and the reformed crime boss argue amiably about whether jollof or kimchi stew was the superior comfort food. "You know," he said, mouth full, "for a man who ran a criminal empire, he is remarkably bad at getting his way." He swallowed. "I like him. Don't tell him I said that. Let him earn it. He earned it, not with money. There was far less of that now, and neither of them missed it the way you would think. He earned it the way it turns out love is actually earned, which is slowly, in 10,000 small, ordinary, undramatic ways. By reading the names, by wanting nothing back, by standing in doorways with his hands open, by letting her keep the small rented room for a whole year even after she no longer needed it. Because he understood at last that a woman who has spent her life owned needs to know that her square of the earth is hers to leave. And so it was that on a bright, ordinary Saturday, months later, Vanessa Carter walked back into a pawn shop in Myeongdong. The same one, the same counter, the same man with the lupe. Not to sell anything this time, but because she had made it a small private ritual to walk past the place where the worst chapter of her life had turned, and to remember that she had walked out of it on her own 2 feet. The ring was on her hand, chosen this time, not endured. The pawnbroker looked up, recognized her after a moment, and something almost like shame crossed his face. "The lady with the ring," he said. "You never came back to collect anything, so I assumed—" "I came back for everything," Vanessa said, and smiled at him, and left him puzzling over it, because it was true in a way he would never understand. She walked out into the sun. Min-ho was waiting at the curb, not in a black sedan behind rain-streaked glass this time, but leaning against an ordinary car in an ordinary coat, watching her come with the open, undefended face of a man who had finally taken down the wall and left the door simply a door. He had a paper bag in his hand. She already knew, before she reached him, that it would be soft tofu stew, and that he would have argued with someone about the pepper, and that he would have lost. He had. It was. He did. "How was it?" he asked. He meant the pawn shop. He knew about the ritual. He had never once asked to come along, and never once asked her to stop. "The same," she said. "Smaller than I remember. Everything from back then is smaller than I remember." She took the paper bag from him and looked up at the man who had watched her from a car on the worst afternoon of her life and gotten every single thing about it wrong, and then spent everything he had making it right. "You know what I thought, standing at that counter the first time? I thought, this is the moment my life ends, the moment I finally become my father." She slid her free hand into his, and it turned out it was the moment it started. I just couldn't see it, because the person who was going to save me was sitting 3 streets away in a car, thinking the worst of me. "I'm sorry," he said, for what she suspected would not be the last time, and she found she did not mind. "I know," she said. "You've said. You'll keep saying. That's all right. Just carry the soup." He carried the soup. "And that," in the end, is the whole of it. He thought she married him for money. He watched her sell her wedding ring, and he built a whole cruelty out of what he thought he saw. Because he had learned somewhere along the way to measure love the way his family measured everything. In what it costs, in what it takes, in the receipts it keeps. But love, real love, keeps no receipts at all. It is not proven by what a person can afford to give you. It is proven by what they will burn down to set you free, and then by their willingness to stand in the ashes with empty, open hands and let you choose whether to stay. Vanessa sold a ring to save a brother, and lost a fortune she never wanted, and in the end, kept the only two things that were ever worth keeping: her family and the right to choose her own life. She never let anyone own her again, but she learned that being freely, fully, forever chosen, and choosing back, with open eyes and open hands, is not the same thing as being owned. Her father had died believing that the men with the money always win in the end. Vanessa lived to prove him wrong, in the only way that has ever mattered, not by getting rich, but by being loved by someone who gave up everything he had and asked for nothing, and by finding, at the bottom of all that loss, the one thing no ledger in the world can ever hold. It is, it turns out, the exact opposite of being owned. And it was worth every single thing she sold to find it. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you wish this story could keep going, it can. The Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories created especially for true Afro-Korean romance fans. Click the link in the description, or simply scan the QR code by pausing the video and opening your phone's camera to get instant access in just a few moments. I can't wait for you to discover your next favorite love story. If this story moved you, if you have ever loved someone enough to lose everything for them and been misjudged for it, do me one small kindness: subscribe and stay with us, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you, and I would love nothing more than to tell you the next one. Until then, besties, take care of the people you would burn the world down for, and never ever let anyone convince you that what you gave in love was ever a debt.